Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Tell me who you are and something interesting that not necessarily defines you, but that is surprising about you.
My name is Shara Evans, and I am a technology futurist and I'm a keynote speaker. And I have been a technologist for pretty much all of my adult life, but I'm also, I suppose we would say, a humanitarian. I really care about what happens to humanity over the long term, not just in my lifetime, but for generations and hundreds and thousands of years to come. And one of my missions is really to help, well, there's a twofold mission with technology. It's to help companies understand how they can use brand new emerging technologies to assist their business or to understand what threats new and emerging technologies, including medical advances and things like COVID, may pose and how to navigate around them, but also to look at the yin and yang of technology and advancements. And, with any kind of technology, there's always good and bad. So even if I think of something as simple as a knife, you can use a knife to prepare a really beautiful meal, but you can also use it to stab someone and kill them. And the same thing is true of any kind of technology, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or almost anything that you can think of. You can use it for good and bad purposes. And part of my mission is to make people aware that technology needs to have oversight built in. And part of that oversight includes privacy and security and making sure that we as a human race maintain the freedoms that we've come to enjoy in our society. And we're right now, Johnny, I think at a pivot point in terms of what happens to our society and to democracies as a whole because of this pandemic that we find ourselves in, and the way that we're giving up a lot of civil liberties because of trying to fight the pandemic. But it may be necessary now, but once you start giving things up, do you ever get them back? And where do you draw the line? So my role is, multifold, and I'm also quite a spiritual person as well, which many people might find surprising as a technologist, that I'm also very deeply spiritual, but I am.
What does that mean? What before we dive in, just so that our terms are straight, when you say you're spiritual, what does that mean to you?
Well,
Because I think lots of people have different definitions of some of these terms.
So when I talk about spirituality, I'm not talking about an organized religion. It's more a philosophy of how I live my life. And that has to do with looking at the bigger picture of the repercussions of my actions as both an individual and as someone who is influencing thousands or perhaps millions of other people, in particular in the use of technology, but across many different vertical industries, including the legal industry, cybersecurity and privacy, artificial intelligence, alternative energy, looking at advanced medicine, looking at the impact of things like COVID-19 and some of the things that could happen as a repercussion of what we do now. And
So is the spirituality aspect of it just a way to have an ethical framework that isn't necessarily, that is sort of ephemeral? Is that what you're talking about?
From a futurist perspective, that's how you would define it. But on a personal basis, I spend a lot of time in deep meditation. And I'll do things like go off into the Amazon jungle for 4 or 6 weeks at a time, or 8 weeks at a time, again, under normal circumstances, and just go into these deep meditation retreats where I can start to visualize the future, what humanity might evolve to, my own life, all sorts of things. And I'm also quite interested in ancient history and in archaeology and in science fiction and all sorts of other things that I combine into the predictions that I make as a futurist, it all sort of gels together, where as a technology futurist, a lot of what I do is based on hardcore science, things that are being rolled out either commercially right now or even in very early stages in research labs, and then extrapolating to the next iteration and the next and the next and the next, and sometimes going hundreds of years out. But by being able to go into really deep, deep, deep meditation and looking at multiple timelines and multiple scenarios, I feel that that gives me a different perspective than someone who may not engage in those practices. And I do other things like formal forecast models and, scenario models and other things that you would expect of a futurist. But I add to that with my meditative practices in my ethical framework of wanting humanity to survive in the longer term and wanting us to survive as a civilization that allows people to enjoy personal freedoms, and that we still have liberty and the ability to express disagreeing viewpoints, but in a non-threatening and polite manner rather than an adversarial manner. And that doesn't mean that you can't get into a really good debate with somebody. It just means that you don't do it in a hateful way.
Speaking of survival and the future, obviously, there were many people that predicted COVID, or not COVID specifically, but a pandemic. And we didn't listen, unfortunately, or most societies didn't listen and prepare, or the ones that did threw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were. So what is the next, not necessarily disaster, something that is gonna, I hope that COVID gives us a reset in many positive directions, but it's definitely going to change how we operate for quite some time. So what's the next thing that's going to change everybody's lives all at once?
Well, before I get into that, I'd like to just go back to the whole idea of a pandemic and people predicting a pandemic, and could we have actually been better prepared? And from the perspective of a technology futurist and someone who looks at medical advances, absolutely, I could say at some point in time, there would be a major pandemic. But what I couldn't say specifically, and I don't know if anybody could have said specifically, is it's going to happen on a particular date at a particular time with a particular type of medical outbreak, whether it be a viral infection or some other type of big scale medical problem. So while we know that that is a possibility, and I think our hospitals and healthcare systems certainly could have been better prepared. For instance, we should have had ample supplies of medical masks available for healthcare workers. We should have had supplies of latex gloves and sterile gowns and things like ventilators, and even enough available for the general population. That was a big misstep that we should have been able to stockpile some of these things. However, in talking to people in the medical community, what I've learned is that some of this type of equipment does have a use by date, where, especially if there's any kind of rubber or latex involved, it starts to deteriorate after a point of time. So there's only so much that you would invest in at a given point in time unless there's a specific problem. And let's say, we had the foresight to know it would be a virus that would require ventilators, but you don't know when exactly it's going to happen. How many ventilators do you stock up? Or what if the virus has a different kind of impact on the human body, and it's not ventilators that you use that are most needed, it's something else? How do you know in advance what those something else things are going to be? So while you might say, well, we know that there's a really good chance of a pandemic happening, how do you know the exact nature of what it's going to be and the specific equipment that you need to buy, when and where to store it? And, how do you develop a vaccine in advance for something that hasn't actually arrived yet? So you can predict that these things might happen, but you don't know enough detail to actually stop it right in its tracks. But having said that, there are a lot of mistakes that we made when the outbreak first started to happen. One of the first things we should have done was, as we started to recognize that it was going global very quickly through airline travel, we should have, in hindsight, just stopped travel, closed borders, used masks, prevent the spread in the first place. But even now, we're getting outbreak after outbreak because we still have borders open. And I know that this is really contentious because I, like most other people, would like to be able to travel. I'd like to be able to see my family, which is in the US, and I'm in Australia. I'd actually like to be able to go between different states in Australia. We're now back in another round out here where they've closed the borders to the state that I live in. So I live in Sydney, which is in New South Wales, and I can't travel to any other state in Australia because of another outbreak. And I know that there are similar things happening in America and, so on and so forth. And not only that, but we've now got different strains of this virus. And I see the outputs of all of this as the next thing that we really have to be worried about, that's, on the horizon, that I can definitely see as a futurist, is that because this pandemic has now lasted for just over a year, or just about a year, since we've discovered it. And there's now this new, more virulent strain that's occurred in the UK, where the UK is now in total lockdown again, but it's already spread to other parts of the world. And in listening to medical specialists, my understanding is that there may be multiple strains. I think we're going to see this for, unfortunately, a while. And the thing that concerns me is that we're really rushing to market with a lot of vaccines, and we need to do this. We need to get this thing under control. But with any new medication, or any medication at all, there are always side effects. And if you take something to market really, really quickly and you don't have a chance to test it on a population of people who have a lot of different medical conditions, or maybe taking a combination of different drugs, you don't know what all the side effects are going to be. And one of my fears is that vaccines may become mandatory. And, there are arguments pro and con, but from the perspective of an individual's sovereignty over their body, I get very concerned if someone were to say, hey, Shara, you've got to get the jab, no matter what your medical condition is, or no matter what your philosophical views are about this, whether they be philosophical or religious based or medical based, that you've got no choice. You can't get it, or you can't go to a grocery store. Or like right now, and this is for real, there are a number of airlines that are already saying, we're not going to let people travel internationally unless they have proof of a vaccine. But then it gets really complicated, Johnny, and just let me know when you want to jump in. And part of the complications have to do with the mutation of this virus, and also the fact that we have a lot of different companies that are developing slightly different ways of combating the virus with different vaccines. So let's say you make a vaccine mandatory. The question is, which vaccine is it? And is it going to be as effective against a strain that may be prevalent in Australia today? as a strain that may be prevalent in Los Angeles, or even perhaps a slightly different strain that's prevalent in New York, or the strain that is developing in the UK. So even if you go ahead and take this mandatory vaccine, not knowing what the long-term impacts may be, it may not even be effective against whatever this virus mutates into.
From what I understand, I mean, these strains, basically from the two different strains that they've discovered, the thing that they know is that it impacts people with different viral loads. And from what I understand, and there's a guy that I was actually just introduced to, who is one of the foremost immunologists, who was saying that even in the general COVID, the thing that is baffling, and they've never seen anything like this, is that how this presents is, they've never seen anything like this in terms of a virus, because there's no commonality. So somebody can come in, he was telling me, with 100-degree fever and be fine for a couple of days. And literally, and this was actually a person that they treated, 27-year-old, ended up dying. Coming back, they discharged him from hospital, came back 2 days later, ended up dying. And he's saying this is across the board. We don't know like what the difference is. So we haven't been able to, did he have an extra viral load? Why didn't he present with all these other symptoms that we've seen? Because his breathing, his oxygen count was up when they released him.
Yeah.
And the thing that is so, and this is doctors, I'm speaking to my MD about this, they really, you know, when somebody has the flu, they have 102 fever, they have a sore throat, they have a cough. There are, you know, 90% of times they will have various symptoms with COVID. And now with these other strains, from what I understand, is that the presentation isn't just the three things: temperature, low oxygen, stomachache, vomiting. It's like 12 things, but somebody can come in with just one of those things, which is unlike a lot of things that they've seen before, where you literally, if you've got, I don't know, yellow fever, you've got X, Y, and Z, right? With this, and this is the thing that's so difficult for doctors on the ground to deal with, because how do we know who has got, you know, is it the amount of viral load? Is it the fact they've got pre-existing conditions? Is it a whole multitude of things that I'm certainly not an expert in? But what I think, and again, I don't know this because this is not my area of expertise, but from what I understand, these different strains are still going to be, and again, there was a really good article about this, actually, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal. It's not that it's a different virus. It's not that the vaccine won't work on this virus. It's that the presentation of it will be more severe particularly they were talking about the strain from England. I mean, that's which they now said is spread, but I think you're right. I don't know if it's spread so much as the virus here has just got more wily and got more severe. And again, I don't know, but I think the point, I think where you were going with this that was really interesting is can we have societies or singular societies or countries, you know, actually, well, you can in places like China, can they basically force everybody to do the virus? And if they do, what is the sort of long-term effects of that? Which I think is where you were going with that. And I think that's because on the one hand, I mean, we tell people, I mean, I think you have to get TB here. What else do you have to get here? Like you have to. I mean, there are
yellowpox and measles.
Yeah.
I think there's a whole bunch of things that you have to get.
Yeah.
But
yeah, there's obviously the anti-vaxxers, and obviously you don't want to put that in the hands of the state. But I mean, I don't know that we have any choice right now if we want to get this under control. I don't know that we do.
You know, you're absolutely right in that this virus is so tricky because it presents differently in different people. And the other thing that caught us really off guard and continues to catch us off guard is that it has a long incubation period. So somebody could go through a 14-day quarantine, be tested before and after, they come out negative. And I think you alluded to this. And then a day later, they develop the symptoms, and they may not even show the symptoms, but they're actually now a super spreader, and they're spreading it to other people in the community, like Typhoid Mary, who didn't have any symptoms, but it's now going wider and wider. But if, let's just go back to this whole idea of viruses and the normal flu. Every year there's another flu shot, and that's because the flu has mutated and there's a new strain. But the flu shot that you would take this year is different than you would take last year because of that mutation of the virus. And it's why we don't have a cure at this stage for the common flu, much less for COVID. And my fear is that this virus, which is trickier than the common flu, and certainly has a higher death toll from the numbers that I can see, could mutate to where even if we develop vaccines very quickly and we have a society that decides, okay, we're all going to do this irrespective of our philosophies because we just need to nip this thing in the bud and be able to get back to living normal human lives. So we all take the jab, or a couple of jabs as the case may be, but this darn thing has mutated again, and the vaccines that we develop today aren't going to be effective against this mutation that could very well occur if it acts like the common flu in 6 months or 12 months. And that's one of my greatest fears, is that even if we get it under control for a while, we may see these new strains come out. Somebody tests negative because they're testing against the strain that's there today. And then we end up with this whole super spreader impact again. And we just keep going through these cycles of lockdowns and vaccines. And
So do you think this is the new normal then?
I think we're going to have to get to the point where we actually use a combination of medicine and technology to really nip this in the bud. And I've talked about this in some of my recent speeches, and it has to do with nanotechnology. And here I'm talking about itsy bitsy teeny weeny little robots that are already in research labs. Lots of different researchers around the world have been working on this for years now, not necessarily for COVID, but for things like cancer and other diseases, where we develop little nanobots that are able to get into the body and actually sense when something is going wrong and nip it in the bud before it actually develops into a full-blown disease. I think if we were to fast forward 10 years to where this kind of technology, which is part of this whole idea of precision medicine, like really targeted medication, initially to fight disease, but eventually to perhaps even live in our bodies and act as defenders in addition to our immune system and white blood cells and other, things in our human bodies, to give us that extra technological boost to be able to fight off these invaders. So fast forward 10 years, and I think it might take that much time before we really have nanobots that have been properly tested in humans rather than just experimentally in animals, but that are tiny enough to be able to literally get to a virus, which is microscopic. And part of the problem that we have in medicine with fighting coronavirus is that viruses are microscopic and they're inside of cells. And it's very, very difficult to get to something that's that tiny. Whereas when we start talking about nanomedicine, then we're talking about medications that are actually even smaller than viruses. So you're actually then being able to fight fire with fire. I think if we then had that kind of weapon in our arsenal, we could be really targeted with the medications that we use to fight specific strains of coronavirus or whatever the next pandemic happens to be, whether it's viral or something else. and get at it at the microscopic level and stop it before it does any damage. And that's
So,
my hope, is that, researchers will be putting, initially we've got to work with what we have now, but this idea that I have that we should be using nanotech to add to our armory, it's not something that's science fiction. It sounds really science fiction, but I was reading a few weeks ago that some researchers in Japan who had been working with nanotech medicine were already looking at this as, if you like, the next generation of nanomedicine that we ought to be looking at. And there are all different kinds of little nanobots that are being developed. And I could go deeper into that if you want me to. But I think that that may ultimately be how we end up defeating these kinds of pandemics and all kinds of other illnesses from happening, either with nanomedicine or perhaps even with genetic engineering. Genetic engineering, I think, maybe a little bit further out on the horizon, because there's still a lot that we don't understand about all the billions of different base pairs. We've mapped them out, but we don't actually know what all of them do and what triggers all of them. So that may be more on the 30 or 40-year horizon, but we definitely need to get this into control. And this may be a tool that we have that combines medicine and technology that lets us do that.
So just to move on from there, but to go back to the privacy and fundamental rights that we may or may not be giving up, or why are you so focused on that aspect of the future, or why are you so worried about that personally?
Look, if it was just to control the virus, then I wouldn't be as worried. But what I have seen is that every time a freedom has been rolled back for the sake of national security, or in this case, for the sake of health, we end up losing that freedom forever, or at least for a very long time, and that it changes the way that we live our lives. So, for example, this is really concrete. If you think about what happened with 9/11, that was horrible. It was an awful terrorist incident. A lot of people died, and there were a lot of secondary impacts. But that one incident continues to impact lives around the world today. Every time you fly somewhere, you now basically are doing the equivalent of a striptease in an airport, and of course, there's not a lot of flying going around right now. But that one event actually changed the course of human society and human liberty. In Australia, we have something called a Metadata Retention Law that was passed a number of years ago, where basically ordered by the government through law to collect metadata about all the communications of people and business organizations, and collect it and hold it for a period minimum of 2 years. And it was meant to be able to be accessed in the case where there was some sort of imminent terrorist threat or imminent national security incident, or something that required warrantless access to real-time information about communications from any given person or any given company around the country. But what I've seen over the last number of years is massive scope creep. So initially it was meant to be available only in these situations of national security, but then we started to see applications from I'm just trying to think of the American term, organizations that cover workers' compensation, or racing commissioners like racehorses. And, and we're talking about warrantless access to information. So if someone has committed a crime, let's say, with betting, and gambling, there are laws that would allow legal access to that kind of information. But to be able to get access without a warrant in my view, is an erosion of liberty. And we're seeing here more and more organizations looking to access that pool of data that has now been collected without a warrant to do so, even though it was ostensibly put together to help protect us against these really serious national threats. So time and time again, as I look at areas where we've given up freedoms for the sake of the betterment of society, because nobody wants a massive terrorist attack on their homeland or, even in their city or anywhere in the world, really. Most sane people wouldn't want that. But to give up your civil liberties if you've committed, or are suspected of committing some sort of more mundane, misdemeanor or even.
So what is the balance between, is this a binary proposition, do you think, that in order for us to be safe and secure, we have to give up aspects of our privacy? And you're saying, and then obviously the danger is that once we give it up, we don't get it back.
The danger is the scope creep. And what happens is that these bills get passed, and a lot of times industry organizations, and particular with the metadata in Australia, so I'll use that as an example. All of the telcos and ISPs went together and said, hang on, this legislation has so many loopholes, it's worse than Swiss cheese. You had legal organizations saying the same thing. You had civil liberties groups saying the same thing. You had giants like, Facebook and Google and Amazon and, all the other, big name social media companies all saying the same thing, that, this is bad legislation. It's not written tightly enough to be able to control who might have access. And that's the problem that I see, is that when we're in a situation like a pandemic, or we're worried about a terrorist threat, or whatever the problem du jour might be, we start to rush through legislation that may not be thought out as well as it should be, and doesn't have the checks and balances to ensure that it's used only for the purposes that it was conceived. So when it comes to something like putting in contact tracing for COVID, or having, a coronavirus vaccine repository, what we need to be really careful of is that whatever legislation or systems are put in place has the right checks and balances, so that it's only used for the purpose that it was designed for, and that it's not then turned around and used for purposes for which it was not designed, that further erode our civil liberties in ways that have nothing to do with the original concept. So, for instance, if I talk about something like a coronavirus vaccine record, and we're using that for travel purposes or for entry into various places, put aside the ethical issues of, gosh, what if you've got some other kind of medical condition that you're afraid might be exacerbated by taking this, and you don't want to do it because you're afraid that it's equivalent to getting a lethal injection, for you in particular, let's just put that aside. So let's just say that we're talking about a coronavirus record, and basically it's a healthcare record that contains a lot of really, really personal information. What if there's scope creep, and suddenly that's used to decide whether you're allowed to be a visitor to a country, even if you've had, all the proper inoculations, but they're looking at all these other social things about who you might be in contact with. And they decide, well, you've got a friend of a friend who has said something bad about, a particular policy, and we don't like your friend of a friend of a friend. So therefore, you're not going to be allowed to come into a particular venue or a particular country. Or what if it goes to employment, where you've got this vaccine record that shows that you may have at some stage caught coronavirus and recovered from it, but they consider you a long-term health risk, and therefore they don't want to hire you ever, so suddenly you find that you can't get a job. So there's this whole issue of scope creep that concerns me, and it could happen in lots of different ways. And I'm not saying it's going to happen that way, but that's why I get concerned about things that are rushed out and not really thoroughly thought through, in that there's the potential for scope creep beyond the initial reason for doing something.
Do you think, to answer whether you can answer it definitively or not, can we have both privacy and security?
I think we can, if we design in privacy and security by design. And with almost every technology that I look at, and I'll add one more, ethics, okay? Because ethics is also part of this equation as well. I think if we design products and services with security, privacy, and ethics as part of the design principles, rather than slapping it on after the fact, that we actually can have the best of both worlds. But unfortunately, in today's world, security, privacy, ethics, it comes as an afterthought, not as part of the design process. And that is what I think, Johnny, fundamentally has to change, is that it's got to be part of the design process. If we can make that shift, then I think that we can actually achieve our goals in a way that gives us the democratic and free society that I love. I think you might love too.
I do. Well, let's, practically speaking, because the example that you've been speaking about is a real one. I mean, it may not be a real one yet, but it's going to be a real one very soon. As you say, there are various airlines, there are various countries. Right now, my father that just went to, just left England to get, because he knew this was coming.
Oh gosh, good thing he left.
Yeah, he left. But I mean, it's and he's fully vaccinated. I mean, supposedly he got the first dose on the second day and got his other dose, and then he was out. But so these passports, or what do they call them now? These vaccine passports, or these vaccine record things that are going to be all important.
Discussed, and like there is no one that's actually out there right now. There are a lot of companies that are looking at different ways of potentially implementing it, and a lot of gotchas, because there are a lot of different vaccines being developed. So it's not like there's just one vaccine that we're tracking.
No, I completely get it. I mean, but if you're designing this, or part of the team that's thinking about this, how do you make sure that privacy, which by its very nature, because you want everybody to take this, right? How do you build a system that is going to give people the privacy they need and offer them the security, which, forget the unintended consequences of whether it works and other pre-existing conditions, we'll put that to one side, as you did before. But how do we engender the privacy aspect of it, with it being a given that if they take it, that it will be safe, secure, and that it will work?
It's not even so much building it into the app. I mean, the app obviously has got to be as secure as possible. It's about who gets access to that information and under what circumstances, and how is that information stored and where, and could it be hacked into? And when it comes to hacking, geez, there's some really scary stuff going on. Have you heard about, and this is just really recent in the news, but I don't know if you've heard about it, the so-called Russian espionage hack into the US government, initially into Treasury and Commerce, which came out in mid-December. And allegedly it's a state-sponsored Russian hack. I can't say for sure, but I've been catching up on this. It's apparently cyber warfare, and it's espionage that was done through source code updates from a very complex network management system made by a company called SolarWinds. Apparently they were hacked. and they think it was a state-based actor, and they think it was Russia. And it was first discovered in US government departments in December, and it's been pretty quiet. But apparently, as of a couple of days ago, because this software is so prevalent in a lot of corporate and government organizations, apparently there are about 18,000 organizations that have been impacted by this. And right now, they believe that it's at the information gathering stage where, again, they believe it's state-based, and that this particular security breach was done to be able to determine what was happening at the government level and in corporate level, from a state-based perspective. But apparently this hack gives what they call God privileges to hackers inside systems. And it's been there for months and only discovered recently. And this sort of thing happens, unfortunately, in the scary cybersecurity world, where stuff gets into trusted software through a variety of means, sometimes through people that are, literally hired by a company, but they're actually bad actors. There's, they look like normal people, act like normal people, but they're the equivalent of like a James Bond type of spy, who's a cybersecurity specialist, and they insert this code into real software that's meant to be protecting networks. And instead of protecting networks, it's actually creating backdoors. This is actually becoming a big deal, but it's not being talked about in the mainstream media, although it should be. But right now, it's sort of quiet because nothing bad has happened. So they think, cybersecurity circles that and articles that I've been reading, they think it's just at an information gathering stage. But if you have the equivalent of a software virus inside of all kinds of government and major corporate networks, then you're actually setting up platforms for massive cyber terrorism. And we're talking about things like maybe turning off the electric grid or turning off water supplies or all kinds of things that would just make
scary stuff.
Like we think that Corona is horrible. Imagine Corona plus no power, no food, no traffic lights working, no data centers working, no internet, no cell phones, no means of communications. Wow. That's like super scary. And this isn't something I've just made up to scare you. Like this is actually, if you search for it on the internet, and you look at, Russian espionage, US government or SolarWinds hack or, something of that sort, you'll find a range of articles and technical publications about it. I think it might have been on mainstream news for 1 or 2 days, but because there was nothing that actually, quote, happened, it sort of went off the radar in a blip, but it's still lurking out there.
Are you telling me this as a sort of, these are other things that corporations are concerned about, or is this just like, oh, let me mess around with your sleep tonight on top of everything else?
Well, I don't want to mess around with anybody's sleep, but I want to make people aware that there are really dark uses of technology that are out there, that even companies, government agencies that are, trying to protect trade secrets in, government business, that can get hacked into in ways that you wouldn't normally think of. And these things are so sophisticated that they can go undetected for a very, very long time, sometimes for years. If I go really dark into cybersecurity, which I do in some of my cyber speeches, I end up scaring people, but I do it to make them aware. It's not so that I'm scaring people, but I want people to know that they need to be careful about the software that they download. And, even just on your own computer, when you download something, or click on a link, be careful. Just, always
be safe.
be safe. Yeah. So it's not just medical stuff that might be lurking around the corner in the, you were initially asking me about what do I think might be, the next near term type of thing that we have to worry about. And this was one of the other near term things that is now very much on my radar, because it's not just a supposition. We know that cyber attacks happen all the time. We know that breaches happen all the time. This has been going on for a while now, but this looks to be like a large scale state-based attack. And again, I'm saying allegedly by, state-based, because that's what the news media is reporting. I don't have insider information on this, but it is.
No, I mean, I think everybody said, I mean, I think it was public. I mean, that it was Russia. I mean, at least here, that's how it was reported. It was reported that it was a Russian hack, and it was more than likely state sponsored, and that they basically got into the treasury. And they actually reported on it for days. As we think about the big issues, whether they be climate change or poverty.
Oh, that's another one on my list too. Yeah, and poverty and
AI run amok, and supercomputers gobbling everybody up and killing everybody.
I'm concerned about AI running amok than I am about
Elon Musk is. So as you think about those and others, what else are corporations concerned about that might surprise the everyday public?
Well, I think a lot of people, and it's not just corporations, but certainly corporations are part of this and really coming on board, is sustainability. I think we're starting as a human race to realize that we live on a beautiful blue marble, and all of the things that we've been doing in terms of energy consumption and pollution have been harming our environment, and that there are consequences to our ecosystem. And whether climate change is man-made or cyclical in nature or a combination, I happen to think it's probably a combination of planetary cycles plus, whatever we do as humans. I think sustainability is something that's starting to be on the radar of a lot of governments, for sure, and also corporations. There are companies that I know of that, financial institutions that say, well, we only invest in companies that use green technology. In other words, renewable technologies. One of the next big boom areas that I think we'll see, where there are a lot of opportunities, will be in the alternative energy space. And we already have solar energy and we have wind energy, but there are drawbacks to those. You need wind, you need to be in a sunny place, and obviously at night you're not going to get sun, and it may not always be windy. But there are some other really cool technologies being developed, like green hydrogen, where literally you can take water and split out the oxygen and the hydrogen, and use the hydrogen as a fuel or for electricity generation, or to store in batteries. And from that, you can make green ammonia, which has the benefit of not putting methane into the atmosphere. There's another really cool technology called blue energy, which you may or may not have heard of. It's basically using the kinetic energy of where fresh water, like from a lake, meets an ocean. And where you get fresh water and salt water meeting each other, it produces kinetic energy that can be captured by nanoporous membranes and then stored in hydroelectric plants and used for energy distribution. And the only output out of that is brackish water, and that's like salty water, which is completely natural on the planet. There's even something that I was reading about a few days ago, and I don't know a lot about it yet because I only read about it over the holidays, and of course everything's closed, so I haven't had a chance to make any phone calls and do an investigation. But apparently there is a company out here in Australia that's looking to come up with self-charging battery technology that uses energy generated from our skin and from the humidity in air, which is kind of crazy. It's like, whoa, how does this work? I want to know more. So I'm waiting for the holidays to be over to be able to do a little bit more investigation into this kind of technology. But these are the sort of things where I think, as a futurist, wow, this is really cool stuff to think about. And also when it comes to things like sustainability and climate change and the impact of COVID on a lot of businesses where people have found themselves, hardworking businesses just not able to make a living anymore because people can't gather at events or people can't go to their store. There hasn't been enough traffic to stay, they're locked down, whatever the case may be. I think we may see our society starting to move back in some areas into what I would call self-sustained communities or off-the-grid communities, where you're literally designing communities that use green technologies to harness energy. You're harnessing rainwater, you're using hydroponics, you're building with recycled refuse, maybe using gigantic 3D printers to do that. And they're already invented, by the way, that they can use construction refuse to make very cheap buildings, and doing it in a very eco-friendly fashion. And you're developing communities of people who are willing to pitch in with whatever skill sets they have, build these communities, help each other out, but actually not exchange money as we know it, but actually exchanging time and knowledge to be able to look after each other as communities. And we may start to see that, especially if this virus continues for years and years and years, that this is a trend where our society will start to splinter in a way between sort of urban dwellers and people who have the ability to earn an income through a job, to people who've decided to go into more of an off-grid, not necessarily disconnected from the rest of the world, but off-grid in terms of being self-sustaining, growing organic food, harvesting their own energy, harvesting whatever they can and supporting each other more through barter type of systems than necessarily exchanging money, exchanging time and energy, and looking after people if they're not well. It's sort of almost going back to the future, back to the past in some ways of communities. I think we are likely to start seeing some of that happen, especially if this virus continues.
So are you saying that we're going to see more insular societies that are stateless or individual? I mean, I'm confused as to the role of government or the role of how do they work? And is this short term, long term?
I haven't mapped all of this out yet. These are just ideas that I've been toying with over the last couple of months. And I've really been thinking more about the pragmatic side of how might you build these communities. I don't see them initially as being stateless. So if I think, here in Australia, what if I were to buy a plot of land and say to people who have skill sets, hey, how would you like to join in with me and help me grow, an organic farm, help me put together, buildings so that we can become a self-sustaining community. And these are the different kinds of skill sets that I need to be able to make us self-sustaining, so that if our supply chain is interrupted by COVID and we can't get food from normal sources because the shelves in the supermarket are bare, which has happened, during COVID, or something else has happened, we can continue to have a life and have a community. So I've been thinking about those types of things, but I don't see them as being a breakaway from the state. I don't see them forming necessarily new countries. They're just a community of people who've decided that we're going to band together as a bunch of people who help each other out. And today we do that in family units, but tomorrow we may be doing that in units that aren't necessarily related by blood, but be quote related by a philosophy of how they want to live their life.
So basically, just like we're talking about old world towns or villages, basically a collection of people basically brought together by something that unites them, and not necessarily a flag, but some sort of altruistic model where we're going to help each other and we're going to do it within this community. Makes it sound like all the other communities aren't going to help each other though. Everybody out for themselves.
Well, right now, if you walk down your street, how many of your neighbors do you know?
More than I used to. I mean, I'm more wanting to be in a community. So I think part of the onus is on me as an individual. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily because I've lived in an urban place or now I'm here in a suburban place. I mean, for me, it's like, oh, I'm in a community. I need to invest in that community, right? I mean, but I think there was a time in my life where I didn't want to. I wasn't that keen on investing in my community.
What you do for a living, so if you're at home and you're allowed to socialize with people, right now we're actually being discouraged from socializing with people, then you might get to know more of your neighbors. If you're someone, up until COVID, like me, where you were constantly traveling to different parts of the world, it gets kind of hard to know a whole bunch of people in your community because you're not actually there all the time. So, these things will vary by individual and also by, how gregarious or not they may be as people. But, again, these are just different things that I think of as a futurist in the way that society may develop as a result of things that are happening now. And I'm not saying it's going to be widespread throughout all of society, but I think we might start to see more pockets of this arise if this disease continues for a longer period.
Has COVID really affected the way that you're sort of looking at forecasting and future planning? Has it sort of shifted your approach to future planning and your work?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, my life has certainly gone topsy-turvy. I was a professional keynote speaker. I mean, I still am, but I was used to going to different venues around the world and speaking in front of hundreds or thousands of people. And a lot of my socialization, social contact with people was when I was traveling and meeting people and, talking to audiences and researching things for, different conferences and doing custom presentations. And I loved hanging out at conferences and just getting to know people from all around the world and, different industries and meeting a lot of people that way. So COVID has definitely changed that, for me as a person. But in terms of forecasting, it's made it much more difficult for me to look at a near-term forecast because we're just dealing in an era where there are so many wild cards in the very, very near term that it makes it really difficult to do forecasts in the near term. Actually, I think longer term forecasts at this stage are easier for me than nearer term forecasts. Whereas if you had asked me a year ago, I would have flipped it around and said nearer term forecasts are easier because I know what's coming out, technology wise and med tech wise, I know what's on the horizon and I can easily extrapolate from what's almost commercial to what's going to be commercial and see what the implications are. Whereas with something like coronavirus in the mix, there are just so many wild cards that we don't know. The near term becomes much harder.
I mean, part of it is that on the one hand, this is a global pandemic, but the answers, and we've seen this on the ground, are local. I mean, it's really the ultimate sort of test between public and private partnerships, local and state and federal. I mean, it's the ultimate test of all these things that in theory, in systems that are actually robust and are working together and understand each other, should actually be a wonderful way. But we have all sorts of actors in the world who don't want to either trust or dictate even the how things are going to be. And also you've got completely different cultures in their approach to, I mean, China, it's very easy to say, don't go out, you're on lockdown, because they'll be shocked, right? Whereas I'm sure in Australia, as in England, if you go out to the supermarket and you're not allowed, you're not getting shocked. You may get a fine, right? So,
Yeah. Well,
so you've got all these different pieces.
and in different parts of the world, you see different things. So here in Australia, I've been wearing a mask ever since I could get my hands on one. And even before I could get a mask, because they weren't available initially, I was wrapping my face in a scarf just to try to prevent contagion. Although I know that, you know, a virus is going to get through there. But what I was trying to prevent was actually touching something that was infected and then touching my nose or my mouth. You know, so I saw that as a barrier, you know, of protection, you know, against me inadvertently infecting myself. Or if I happen to have it and I sneezed or something, you know, again, it's a barrier against a large droplet, but not against a microscopic droplet. But here, where I was going was, it's only been in the last few days that in New South Wales, where I live, masks have been made mandatory in public places, which I just find incredulous. You know, I can't tell you how many times over the last year where I had gone to stores and I would see hundreds of people and I'd be the only person who was wearing a mask. And
The Australians, we're not going to comment on that.
you know,
No comment. I know that you want to talk a little bit about space travel, because you know it's going to be a big thing. I mean, with the likes of Richard Branson and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all of them. So why do you think, why are you so excited about space travel? I'm excited too.
Well, being a futurist and a sci-fi geek, how can I not be excited about space travel, right? You know, it's something that I've been thinking about ever since I was old enough to think about things. You know, I mean, I remember thinking about it when I was in my, you know, toddlers watching cartoons and thinking, oh gosh, I want to fly, you know, be able to fly around to different planets and do, you know, all these different crazy things. But the things that were once in the realm of science fiction are now becoming science fact. And it's because private industry has invested in developing reusable rockets. And that to me is the real game changer. If you can imagine an airplane that you can only use once to fly between Sydney and LA, it would cost a fortune to get between Australia and America. And it's not cheap as it is, but you know, you can just imagine what the price tag would be if you got to use an airplane once. But if you have spacecraft that you can use again and again and again, and you've got fleets of them, then you start to get to the economics of where it becomes viable to start looking at habitats on extraplanetary locations like the moon and Mars. They would be the two that I would pick first and then expand outwards. And the reason I would say the moon and Mars is that there have been a number of recent discoveries over the last number of years and even over the last few months on the sunlit part of the moon. There's actually water on the sunlit part of the moon that they didn't know was there. And there is evidence that was uncovered a few months ago on Mars that looks like there are times when water is still flowing around the Hale crater on Mars. And that actually bodes really, really well for setting up a human colony at some stage in the future. It's not going to be tomorrow, but if we're going to actually live on another planet, we need to have resources. And the number one resource that we need that we can't carry enough with us would be water. So if we can have access to clean water on the moon and Mars, then we actually have a chance of really setting up habitable colonies on these remote destinations and eventually perhaps even terraforming them and using them as launch pads to go even further out into our solar system and beyond. And I think that our space technologies will continue to develop and will develop, you know, faster and faster methods of propulsion. You know, scientists now say, oh, well, you know, there's X limit to how far you can go. But, you know, I think that's short-sighted thinking because we're looking at science as we know it today. And anyone who's studied science over, you know, the course of centuries or thousands of years knows that what once seemed magical suddenly is not magical anymore. It's actually hardcore science, and things like wormhole travel sounds completely not so, maybe, or science fiction. but maybe it's possible. Or what about warp speed faster than light? You know, if you can imagine it, then you can invent it, you know, as long as the laws of physics allow it. And what I'm discovering with a lot of the physics that I study is that many of these science fiction ideas that used to be in the realm of pure fantasy, they're suddenly discovering that there's real science that they can measure and experiment with that backs it up. And a lot of it has to do with quantum physics. And I won't go real deep into that because I'll bore everybody in the audience, but I just find it a really exciting area. And I think in terms of excitement for the human race and survival of the human race, if you think about space exploration and the number of jobs that will come along with it, wow, like literally the sky is the limit with the number of types of jobs and occupations that space travel would bring with it. And not only that, if we start to spread ourselves out into different parts of initially our solar system and eventually beyond, if something like a pandemic were to occur on planet Earth.
You can spread it to all the aliens.
Well,
no, I'm joking. That was my joke.
Yeah, hopefully we wouldn't do that. But, you know, let's say something really horrible happened here, like an asteroid strike, you know, like, a dinosaur killer asteroid strike, which again, you know, on my black list of black swan things, you know, that's something that in the course of time, we're bound to get hit by an asteroid or a comet. Who knows when? It might be 100 million years from now. And, you know, there's also things like solar flares, you know, which again, we know that it's part of the natural cycle of the sun is that it has flares. And we've just been very lucky since 1859 that a flare has not gone towards Earth. In 1859, there was something called the Carrington event, which, you know, luckily we were still in the early technical age and it took out telegraphs and started fires and did all sorts of things. If a flare like the Carrington event hit us now, oh my gosh, we'd be without power for a long time because we haven't bothered to insulate our grid, which we could do if we spent the money on it, but we haven't done that, at least in most Western countries. So if we become a multi-planetary civilization, then the chance of some catastrophic event wiping us out completely is a lot less likely to happen. And it opens up so many opportunities and so much room for exploration. It's really the new age of exploration. And with exploration comes discoveries about science, about ourselves, about our past, about our future. And who knows, maybe there are other civilizations out there and we'll get to meet them.
I'm excited, honestly. I'm excited about that aspect of the future. I can't wait to do some. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a brilliant, formative book of my youth. So I want to get on that bandwagon for sure.
Yeah, look, I'd love to be able to go to outer space, but I don't necessarily want a one-way ticket. I'd like to be able to go and come back, you know, and, you know, look around. But at some stage, who knows, you know, depending on what happens with genetic engineering, you know, if I end up living to 800 years old because we've turned off the aging switch and managed to reverse aging, which by the way is something being worked on in real science labs. Maybe at some stage I'll decide that I want to live off planet. And how cool would that be if someday you and I are having this conversation, you know, from different planets instead of from different continents?
I have a good feeling about this. We will definitely do that. It was so nice. It was so nice to meet you and it was so fun. So hopefully next time we meet, I'll be in Australia or you'll be in New York or somewhere and we'll have a chat. We don't need to be on one side of the planet. It'd be nice actually just to be in front, like properly. Old school.
Do that. My family's in the US, so getting to the US would be a real blessing for me. I'd love to.
Well, I hope you get to do that soon and get to see your family.